Exceptional Randos show is produced live in Sunroom Studios' Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or a question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Exceptional Radio. Hey, it is June 14th, and the sun is shining. Coronavirus is still a part of our lives, and there is still unrest all over the world in response to police brutality. But today, we are going to be talking about something a little different. We're going to talk about the commercialization of culture and how this redirects the development and evolution of all the things. So, I've noticed that, typically this time of year, we're supposed to be seeing a lot of imagery of festivals and people partying, and I kind of miss seeing those giant sound systems. I think that's actually, that's kind of one of the things that I miss the most, actually, is all these updates about, people having fun and people getting outside and people doing the things that make life kind of worth living, it seems. And, it occurred to me that in all of these images, I'm seeing these giant laser light shows and huge stages and gigantic sound systems, and I can't help but wonder if we're actually perpetuating a consumer cycle, a capitalist cycle that is, in a sense, undermining the original intent of bringing people together. I mean, how can it possibly be about the music when all that we're really presented with is this giant light show?
Well, okay, so there's a couple things in that. So I don't think events like that are ever solely about music, in that if it were solely about music, the performance would happen behind a screen and no one would care about seeing the artist. It would be in complete darkness. In the same performance style as musique concrète, which is done in complete darkness, because the whole point of that style is that if music is completely the focus, then you lose 90% of your senses by adding visual stimulus to it, because your brain literally is a visual-based organ.
Yeah.
That most of the processing for the brain goes to visual systems. So it's like humans' hearing is terrible. And in that, when we're talking about performances, I would posit, based on my understanding and study, that performances are very rarely, if ever, about the music. And it's only been framed about being about the music for the sake of selling the capitalist experience, which is like, the more extravagant the experience, the more people will say the musical theater is worth the ticket price. Because really, again, it's like, if it's really about the music itself, it would come down to being acoustic. And then even in digitally created music, the sound system would be the sole focus, and there would be no lights.
Yeah.
And this comes down to the whole paradox as to why, when people frame these things, there's nothing wrong with performance. There's nothing wrong with entertainment. But when people frame performance as if it's supposed to only be about the music, then they create this false paradigm as to why somebody like Lady Gaga is suddenly not as good as somebody like Kurt Cobain, who does an unplugged performance. People will forever compare the least electronically assisted performance of someone who they'll tout as the most musically inclined performer against the most assisted performance of somebody who's a musician and performer to try to reduce the validity of the performance artist, as if the musician who doesn't perform is actually stepping into the wrong, not the one stepping into the wrong realm. Like somebody who gets on stage and just plays an instrument is actually reducing the performance aesthetic in the performance realm and then claiming it's just about the music. Like I would
Sure.
assert
Well, I mean,
incorrectly.
there are electronic acts like Subtract or Moses Sumney who will essentially bring their studio setup onto a stage, and for the most part, those, from what I've seen, those performances are like, you know, the artist almost in the middle of a room surrounded by the audience. You can't even see the playback system, and what they're doing is, I mean, they're bringing the audience into the studio, and I think on some level that's a really honest representation of the music, because those guys are, you can see their faces and you can see how they emote as they perform. And it's
But it's still performance is
that's
what I'm
true.
getting
Yeah,
at.
no,
Like
I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm
if it wasn't performance, it would be completely in the dark,
Yeah.
done behind a screen where nobody would be able to see what they're
Well,
doing. And
that's
that's why
like
what I'm getting at is it doesn't matter how honest or um transparent or without lights and without animations it is, if it's not done in the dark, it's still a performance, and the least aesthetically pleasing performances are still performances.
yeah,
And that's the problem with like then saying it's all about the music. It's like if you can see them, your visual system effectively
it overrides it.
overrides
Yeah,
your audio system concerning the stimuli. And that's just a byproduct of the way our brain works.
yeah,
Like you can be uh, uh, way moved, emotionally moved by the music, but what you're seeing influences the way you perceive the stimuli more than what you're hearing, and you can't do anything about that except turn the lights off or shut your eyes. And
yeah.
that's the reason music concrete is a thing, but most people have never even necessarily heard of it or understood the concept of it to understand why when they see somebody just playing a guitar, that focal point of the origin of the sound is still a performance. It doesn't, it's just a terrible performance, is what it comes down to. That's really what it is.
Well, you just reminded me of. I remember the first time I heard the Wall, the Pink Floyd album, The Wall, and then when I was in high school, I fell in love with it because I was like, oh wow, this is like protesting fascism and protesting the establishment and all these things. And then later I learned that they had created this unbelievably huge stage performance where the band itself was behind the curtain and you never actually saw them, and there was a big wall that was slowly being deconstructed throughout the entire performance, and it revealed a different band that was just miming the performance, but they weren't actually Pink Floyd. And this I mean, they did this in countless iterations, and I'm not sure if they still do that, that version of the Wall on stage. But I remember when I saw that for the first time, it detached me so much from the actual music being performed and the visual performance, because they weren't really one and the same. They were similar, and they told a similar story, and one was definitely telling the story of the other, but there was no band, and it was a really powerful moment. There's only been a few times where I've actually been to a festival or a concert where I couldn't see the musicians at all, and all I saw was the light show. And typically that kind of bothers me because half the time I feel like I'm too close, or the lights are so bright that I'm being blinded, and that's not what I'm trying to do when I go to a concert. Uh, but I remember seeing Tool at Bonnaroo like 15 years ago or so, and you couldn't see the stage at all. I was far enough away that the only thing I saw was what looked like a fan of lasers sweeping across the sky. And well, I mean, there were also some LED screens that I couldn't tell what was going on either because they were really bright. And I think those were some of the most, that's like one of the most interesting concert experiences I had, because it was me in a crowd of tens of thousands of people, maybe 100,000 people, and all I could do was listen or stare at the back of someone's head. And I really actually enjoyed that. Like that actually stands out to me as one of the most profound music experiences because it wasn't all. I mean, there were lasers, but it didn't seem like that was the actual central attraction. It was this giant sound system that was reproducing music.
And that's a great example of acousmatic performance in that when you disconnect the sound source from the sound itself, it creates this ethereal notion of that sound coming from nowhere effectively. And then it puts you in a different space, which is also why, like, it doesn't have to. Music Concrete is the one I believe that's performing in complete darkness, but acousmatic performance is just simply disconnecting the sound source from the sound itself. So what you're talking about is then an acousmatic performance, which, as you're saying, it puts you in a different space and allows you to focus more on the sound. Because then this is where I think it was Pythagoras um, gave his lectures behind a curtain because he believed that acousmatic lectures were more conducive to retaining the information because the students would then have the more capacity to focus on the lecture rather than what's being presented to them. So this concept goes back thousands of years. But and it's funny that you mentioned the wall because excuse me, the music concrete movement I think started in like the 40s if I remember correctly. Like I could obviously Google it, but I'm trying to just explain the progression in that in the 60s when you see a lot of these movements coming about, they're looking at a lot of Eastern philosophies and then combining them with Western music. So then that's where like the wall performance is like probably steeped in Eastern philosophy, even though it's not necessarily explicit. So like um the visual performance that's like the film that goes along with it, it's very the imagery is very Eastern European aesthetic, like the visual aesthetic I think a lot of people associate with fascism, and like the USSR or even in some cases the Nazi imagery. It's not explicitly Nazi, but it goes a lot around referencing these visual movements and propaganda, but also in that context when we're talking about how they're presenting the sonic landscape without making the band the focus. This is something that they did on multiple occasions, as you're saying, in the performances, but also in the film itself. That was like revolutionary at the time. It's not, they weren't necessarily the first to do it, but for that type of scale of sonic sonic inspired feature film, it's like they really reform. I won't say again. It's not that they reformed, but they took art in a different place that was not the traditional performance.
Yeah, that's. I think that's the sign of a very talented performer. Someone with some kind of they're applying it's the intersection of artistic vision and musical performance that yields or no musical reproduction that yields a type of performance art that has the potential to 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 set to sell a bigger message, to present a bigger message itself. But I don't think that that's actually what's happening with a lot of festivals or concerts even. Like the last show I went to, it was very very much a light show. I don't even remember I don't even remember the music that I paid money to go see. I think it was
Well,
I think
and
it
I
was
think
STS
part of it
nine.
is like producing music is generally not a huge performance, which is why in a lot of cases you have these rock and roll guys that ended up smashing their guitars and setting shit on fire because in reality, playing a guitar is kind of fucking boring.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like that's why they have to headbang and hit power stances and slide across the stage on their knees and really like play it up for the audience because if you sitting around and playing instruments is not fun to look at. It's really
Yeah.
not. I don't care. Drumming can be fun for about a minute or two, but if we're honest, watching people play instruments, unless you're
A
an
musician.
extremely veteran musician that is just looking for new methods, watching another person, it's boring as fuck. If you're getting trained, your teacher doesn't want to watch you play because you suck. So it's like there's all these things about
That's true. They're looking for technical deficiencies or
exactly
failures
they
to
don't
execute
want to be there.
techniques.
That's why you pay them.
Yeah.
And that's where there's all these elements of watching people play instruments is not fun. There's an element of sometimes watching people do things is inherently fun. Watching people play sports can be fun. Everybody doesn't enjoy the same type of sport, but a lot of people end up enjoying playing sports. Or if somebody's playing a video game, a lot of people enjoy watching people play video games. But when it comes down to it, people who go to concerts, there is a whole list of stimuli that go way beyond watching somebody play an instrument, where watching somebody play an instrument is part of it, but that's not what people are there for. And if there was not an overpowered sound system that reverberated the sound waves through your entire body, just watching somebody play an instrument wouldn't be worth it to pay money and drive somewhere.
Yeah.
Like there has to be a super amplified sound system to go with it. Like if you're sitting in a stadium with 20,000 people watching somebody play an instrument with no sound system, people are gonna start throwing shit. If you're at the back of that stadium and you can't hear them because there's no sound system,
Yeah.
people will start throwing shit and cause, like, if they paid for that, even if they didn't pay for it, maybe.
Well,
and that's where you take that sound system for granted.
Yeah, even a giant sound system is more than just a set of speakers. They've got time delay systems so that the speakers that are like 100 feet away from the stage line up so that there's not a weird echo going on. And
yeah, people don't realize that shit, man.
You just reminded me of I think it was like BBC did a televised performance of Led Zeppelin, and the audience was literally sitting on the floor like they were observing classical music performance. Led Zeppelin. And it was electric too. I mean, there was I think there was a full stack, and I'm pretty sure that John Bonham was going nuts, and Robert Plant was doing his "Dude Walks Like a Lady" routine on stage. I know that's a Aerosmith reference, but that's kind of the archetype for that kind of rock and roll singer performance style in a lot of ways. And the audience was quiet. There was no like roaring or throwing shit. They were like in silent observation, almost like they were in church. And we're so far away from that kind of audience participation and performance style now. I mean, the closest that we've been to that is, like you mentioned earlier, is that Nirvana Unplugged set, and they weren't even unplugged. Kurt Cobain, really. he had a electric guitar pickup installed in his guitar, and they had effects pedals on stage, and
so it wasn't even 100% acoustic.
Yeah,
right.
But
even though it's not music, I don't know if you've seen any of the UFC events with no audiences.
That stuff is kind of, it's unnervingly, like, it's unsettling in a sense to see that kind of event like that, but it's also really cool that it's still happening.
Yeah, well, I love it. Like, I didn't know how it would end up being, but I personally am starting to think that crowds are a hugely overrated element of live or public events, and that they reduce the capacity for participation to geographic like proximity.
Yeah.
And further, if we shifted live presentations to being more internet accessible, not to say that people couldn't go in a person, it's just safer. It's just safer all around. And I get people miss the notion of having large crowds and shit where you can just bump and grind against people. And I guess I don't know what else people miss about that stuff because it's like, I don't really need to smell people. I don't really need people spilling beer on me, then half-ass apologizing and disappearing into the crowd.
No, they're
Never actually
apologizing.
caring about it in the first place.
They're apologizing
Like,
to their beer for losing something.
right, yeah. So there's all these things about, it's easy to remember all of the good parts of something when you're not in it and forget all the bad parts. But a lot of shit about crowds sucks.
Yeah.
Like sitting in traffic after an event is over, waiting for everybody to fucking like coordinate their asses out in a line because they can't figure out how to move their cars without honking incessantly and sitting in that. It's like there's so many things about getting humans in large groups in America specifically because everybody's so hyper focused on themselves that they don't take into account if everybody just thought about the other people, everything would move faster.
Yeah. That's an interesting perspective, or perspective of FOMO.
Yeah,
Leaving,
it's really crazy.
You gotta not only were you in a rush to get to the show, but now you're in a rush to leave.
Yep.
The best parties the best parties I ever went to, I didn't want to leave. The best raves that I ever attended, I didn't want them to end. And it was like, stay to the end. And by the time that happens, there's no problem getting out of the parking lot because 70% of the cars are gone and everyone there is worn out. And to last that long at a party, you have to commit. And so by the end of it all, everyone's just kind of chilled out because no one has the energy to be pissed off about it. Well, that's not true. There were definitely some people who still had energy to be pissed off about things. But for the most part, I remember feeling like there were a lot of people who were like, yeah, we made it. We got to the end. We finished the game tonight, guys. Woo! I'm not sure that exists anymore.
Well, it's really crazy because there's a whole element of, it's a super diverse crowd and you can never really homogenize people's intentions because for as many parties as I went to, like I really never, it was always for the music and the party and it was never about the drugs for me. Like I didn't need drugs. Like I stay up till 4 o'clock pretty much now every day and I was doing that then.
Yeah.
I didn't need drugs to be hype. And there's this element of assuming that a lot of people go to parties for drugs and shit, when in reality, I fucking love bass music.
Yeah.
That you can't get that experience anywhere else. So when I was going to these parties, it's because they had a shitload of subwoofers in one place and awesome music to go on top of it.
Yeah.
And people will be like, "Oh, you just love," like, no, I'm at a point right now. I don't give a fuck what anybody thinks about me. I could say it was about drugs if it was about drugs. It wasn't about the drugs. 20 years later, I'm still saying it wasn't about the drugs because it was never about the drugs. And people just can't get that through their fucking thick skulls that some people actually go to, like, raves for music. It's really insane that people can't comprehend that there are actually people that went to raves for music.
Well, there are people who only go to raves because that's where they know they can get the good drugs too.
Of course, those people exist.
I was very similar in my approach to raving. I went because I couldn't reproduce that 100,000, 200,000 watt sound system. I didn't have, a wall of bass cabinets just vibrating the life out of or into me. And even, we can apply physics and scale down the system to the size of a room and get close, but it still doesn't have that energy. Even when we try, you have to have unbelievable amounts of power to achieve that kind of acoustic interaction with the room and your body. And it's impractical. You'd have to have a live sound system or a big PA and do touring sound or provide sound reinforcement for a club or a bar locally to just even have a reason to have that much sound system.
Yep. Well, and it's crazy too because then when you think about it in that way, the notion of what's happening, where everybody's basically being forced onto the same frequency waves, their bodies are literally being vibrated at the same frequency. There's got to be something as to why. And all of a sudden, you have a bunch of people dancing to the same beat. It's not. There's a literal element, and then there's some. Uh, I won't even call it metaphysical. I'll call it the bioelectrical element, where everybody's molecules and DNA strands and blood and brain waves all being forced onto the same signals by such a powerful electrical source. There's got to be something to that as to why. I mean, fights happen at parties, but a lot of the times, the fights happen because the music is like putting people in that vibe.
Hey, we've got a caller. Ryan Conley has something to add to this dialogue here.
Awesome.
Ryan is a longtime listener, and he's a coworker of mine at radiocallisti.org. Hey, Ryan, you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Yep.
Can you hear him, Chris?
Yep.
Okay.
Hi. Yeah, I've just been listening in here, myself and my wife. And I just had something to add in regarding to rave culture versus the drug culture, or just the whole perception in general. I remember, very early on, 91, 92, when raves are really starting to hit the U.S. and pretty hard by 92. And it wasn't like if you were on drugs and you were handling yourself, that was fine. It was a welcome environment for anyone that just wanted to be, dance like a goofball, feel the music. You didn't need drugs. And that kind of goes back to the forerunner of the raves, the acid house parties in Chicago, Detroit, London, Rotterdam. And it was to about create an environment where you felt as if you were tripping. And if you were tripping, more power to you. But yeah, it was never about drugs in general. It was about the psychedelic experience. And that lent itself to LSD, mushrooms, and then, unfortunately, ecstasy. But even with ecstasy, it was still about the psychedelic experience. And it wasn't also meant to be that if you were at a rave or an acid house party that you had to be on these. It was about the culture of it, the psychedelic movement, if you will. The biggest switch I saw came in 94, 95, and that's when crystal meth really hit the clubs and the raves really hard. And it was a total culture flip after that. Since then, I'm sure it's there, it's everywhere, but I don't see it as much of a part or poisoning the culture in that ways. But I really think that on the back end, that had a lot to do with that middle 90s era to the late 90s. I don't know what you guys think about that, but those are just some observations I saw from back then compared to later. Introducing the wrong people and so forth.
That makes a lot of sense to me because I didn't actually start going to parties until 99 when they were like starting to get shut down in Indiana, but the scene has started to switch to now it's like a lot more festival and bar scene, but that's because they started shutting down the warehouse parties more frequently, and we're getting hip to the I remember when they wouldn't release the party location until the day of, and they'd have the number on the flyer, and you'd have to call the number and find out where the party was at the day of, and sometimes not even until like 6 p.m. or something, they wouldn't release the party
Yeah.
location.
Map points
The
and
checkpoint part.
Yeah, and it was
Yeah.
like a fucking
the choose your own adventure.
treasure hunt or some shit. The directions would sometimes be all confusing, just to make sure that cops wouldn't be able to just find it easily. So by that point, yeah, there was a lot of meth in the scene, and it was hard to stay away from drugs. In that, I want to say no, I don't know if it was the CIA or FBI, but I feel like there had been a lot of infiltrations into the scene at that point where there was just so many narcs. Um, it was no longer an organic scene, and I think that it was like when you have FBI doing or whoever or what's it called, ATF or whoever doing investigations for 6-12 months where they have people undercover pretending to be college students, because I remember that type of shit happening where they would have undercover people selling drugs, and then those would be the people that are creating the drug culture, trying to find people. It's so weird how that shit, it sounds conspiracy theory
like
now.
These college age kids of business leaders or even politicians. I think that maybe there's a link there. I don't like feeling potential conspiracy or anything like that, but I even remember a story, like you said, about some sort of weird infiltration. I want to say late 90s, maybe early 2000s. I don't know what city it was in. It might have been New York. But yeah, it was essentially in the same kind of logic with, you see these police creating what looks like riot scenes when they were actually the ones breaking windows and what have you. It was almost like they were creating havoc within these parties to show, oh, that's what these parties are about. Shut them down.
Imagine that, the police causing problems.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it kind of follows that same kind of logic. The infiltration. How did meth get in? So widely distributed. Before we even way before Breaking Bad or anything in mass media. It was and I saw friends of mine just get sick from it, and it really just tainted that culture. And then, like you said, with more and more unnecessary police legal involvement, things really started to change.
Isn't that the template for the entire drug war, though?
Well, I don't know if you guys remember, there was an autistic teenager who was entrapped by an undercover police officer posing as a high school student, who befriended this kid, convinced him to buy her drugs, and then got the teen arrested. He'd never smoked weed before, but she convinced him to do it. So his name was Jesse Snodgrass. This is just one example that was found out, as to where I'm like, you'd hear about this shit in the rave community of undercover narcs selling, they'd be doing all kinds of shit, selling ex fucking girls, fucking guys, doing all kinds of shit, and then not getting caught because other cops were covering it up. So when we're talking about it, it sounds like some conspiracy theory shit, but now we got these motherfuckers killing people in the streets. It doesn't sound so crazy for us to be like, yeah, the cops or whoever infiltrated the rave movement and started selling drugs and making it look way worse than it actually was. It wasn't the kids, it was these fucking cops. And that's where, again, that's where I'm like, I was there. I was one of the kids that didn't like drugs, having my scene polluted by fucking entrapping cops. And that's where I'm like, looking back on it, there was a way more innocent kids being polluted by forces where it's like, I'm not saying it's all cops. There's definitely nefarious people out there.
Yeah, bad
But where did this
actors.
culture come from? Because it wasn't from the fucking, peace, love, unity, and respect. They didn't create this.
Yeah.
They didn't create that culture.
I used to think of it after the beginning of the decline, when Plur stopped being the overarching mantra. I started just thinking to myself, please let us rave. Like I watched this fantastic environment of sound and actually genuinely happy people being taken over by you know drug addicts. He's like, I remember being at parties and people would just walk up to me. He's like, hey, do you know where I could find this? It's like, seriously, do I look like a drug dealer to you? Really? Like,
Well, here's another thing. So Ryan, where were you raving at? What cities were you doing this in?
Chicago, predominantly.
Chicago. So
Um,
my question will be then, when you were raving in like '92, did you see a lot of gay people at the raves? And then was that like something that where I know when we were going, a lot of the kids were gay and had they took solace in that community being accepting of everyone. Early '90s were very homophobic. I feel like people forget how, like, if you go back and watch a '90s movie, they're dropping the real F bomb on there, like in movies a lot, as if it's like no big deal. The '90s were
oh,
not nice to gay people. So, in your experience in Chicago, was there like a lot of positive
there was
acceptance of gay community in the rave scene there?
very much gay presence from DJs, promoters, enthusiasts. You not only had that, but you're also talking about, one of the birthplaces of house music. Um, what was interesting? I mean, sure, you had like gay singles clubs, but dance clubs, everywhere. It seemed like every other city, it was a gay club. If it was playing dance music and there were gay people there, were in Chicago, even back then, it was a dance club.
my
It's a house
understanding.
music club. So the culture, I think, from the house music and acid house music era, really kind of helped build that foundation. Now, going forward, even with that foundation, by late '90s, I saw a lot of it getting trashed, just as you guys did. But yeah, at that time, it was, it was all about diversity. It was basically be apolitical, be a-religious, accept diversity, and party hard. That was kind of it.
Yeah.
Um,
My understanding of the origins of Chicago
and I
House
saw
is
that
that
change.
oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I saw that change. I feel like we were in a more, just as a society in the States at that time, and just sort of this oblivious, idealistic, the walls come down, we want a war. Um, and not even, just a couple years later, Rodney King, you have the GOP taking back the House and or Senate, the rise of Newt Gingrich. There was also a lot of tension unnecessarily built around the OJ trial. I mean, I don't like to, criticize the media for everything like that, especially when I'm talking to the media technically right now. But
I don't know if we're technically the media.
I think technically we're journalists, but because we have our own platform and we're not part of a conglomerate of some sort, we're not a part of the mainstream media.
You're the
Yeah,
good
that's
media,
very true.
or the
Yeah, we're the anti-media. In fact, I think
Yeah.
we're the anti-media in the
there you
equation.
go, for sure.
Oh.
But I really think that there were a lot of, like, we went into the '90s. I just say we as citizens, kind of with this kind of false idealism, and then some things really showed their face, right away. We went from having this almost you know, what's the word? Almost for the first time, utopian style diplomacy with Russia that quickly, by within 10 years, turned to this hardline, very negative. Look where we're back to now. It's just almost, I don't care what you label it. We're still at odds, not placing blame on one leader or another. But I really feel like, that false sense of idealism that we as a culture kind of went into stateside in the 90s really flipped. And I saw when those things flipped in so many ways, it really changed the underground culture, or the underground culture, I should say, got really poisoned.
Where do you think that came from? Because you nailed upon something.
Yeah.
It's like we had, like, society had a different color scheme altogether. Everything was fucking neon. We were wearing hypercolor. People had on weird, like, the early 90s was like a weird time. It's like there was acid in the water or something. Where do you think that fucking false idealism came from? Because it's like people were really stupid, man. Like, and when I go back and look at media,
it was like
the media. People
I hate
were
to say
really
false
dumb.
idealism, but in '90, you had Nelson Mandela was released. There were all these really good things happening, but it was kind of like, okay, we won, it's all done now, and just neglected so much else. And it was like, it was brought all the way up, and then people just kind of forgot about things, and it just crashed, And then by 2000, we've got George W. back, and Junior in the House. I don't know, but hopefully some of this makes sense, and I've been able to add.
Well, yeah,
here
and part
you.
of it is you've seen enough and have a long enough memory as to be able to point at different times in history and say, this is different, this is the same. Because one of the things that I'm really seeing with the protests that are happening now, for various reasons, is I remember the Rodney King protests nationwide. I believe this is different and bigger for various reasons, and the fact that we have social media, the conversation has already moved to the point where we're talking about defunding the police. Even if it doesn't happen, we're having this conversation. So am I crazy for thinking that we've made a lot more progress? I mean, the riots aren't stopping necessarily. Well, I won't call them the riots. The protests against police murder are not stopping.
Dude, that Wendy's burned down last night.
Yeah, and there's going to be people worried more about the Wendy's people's jobs than the guy that got fucking murdered.
Oh, God.
Like, and then this is where I can tell you we're not the media, because the media will call it a fatal shooting. I'm calling that shit fucking murder. Yeah. So when we're talking about the repercussions of police murdering citizens, having immediate reactions, do you think things are different, and do you think they're better or worse? Like, because I just personally feel as a black person that in a sense things have to get worse before they can get better. When people like understand what's actually happening, it's perception of getting worse, but that's just people seeing the reality. Like, you being around gay people, probably being around black people, especially in Chicago, probably gay black people, probably gay trans people. Like, I know gay trans people or trans people that are hetero are still having problems in 2020 that they might have still had in 92 that I wouldn't have necessarily been able to see. Do you think, I think things are getting better. Do you get that same perception?
It's weird because it seems like on the surface, when things are getting better, that the environments that, the music, the clubs that was all part of the, for instance, the the balls, the competitions, your voguing, all of these things. I mean, solidified house music and pushed it and really helped shape it in so many ways. And then I saw how that influence as that whole culture has become more popular, it's like just so much diminished, and in the actual clubs and places where it was most predominant, if that makes sense, over the years.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know a lot of gay areas have been gentrified, and that's like a whole nother issue. But like, there's a gay club in Indianapolis. I think it eventually got shut down because the area around it
Talbot
just,
Street.
yeah,
Talbot,
I don't,
yeah,
and that's like something I think that was common to gay clubs because people wanted to drive them out, and that wasn't a way to do it, making it seeming as if it was apolitical. But it's like, it's like gerrymandering where there's ways to get rid of people or to remove their power without overtly doing it. So that's why I'm asking, because on the one hand, yeah, people like, the GOP is really good at subverting um, oppressed classes, and the left wing is really good at making it seem like they're doing something, but really just appeasing the GOP behind the scenes. But on the same hand, I feel like people are depending less on government to enact change. So there's this other element of like, now as a citizen, I know I have to like speak out for trans people and speak out for gay people because the government's not going to do that. So as a citizen, I'm taking a
right.
stance to like help protect my other citizens when my government's not doing that in a way that wasn't happening in the 90s. Like, citizens were not protecting their trans and gay brothers and sisters in the 90s the way that they're doing now because the government definitely wasn't protecting them then, and now they're trying to take away the protections that they had put in. So that's where I'm like, on the one hand, the government, yeah, the government's always kind of patriarchal, racist, misogynist, homophobic, transphobic. It's always those kinds of things. Even under Obama didn't he wasn't for gay marriage at first. He had to have his arm twisted to get there. So let's not act like
It,
Obama or Hillary Clinton
yeah,
was pro gay marriage at first. Both of them were. Bill Clinton was against gay marriage. Fucking all these people who are so-called left wingers were against gay marriage in the 90s, adamantly, openly. So let's not pretend that they
and you
weren't.
would
So
and you
this
would
is
hear
what
the
I'm
same
saying.
thing. Oh,
Things are
I don't
slightly
think we're
better,
ready for
right?
that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, exactly. They were saying we weren't ready for it. But that's what I'm saying. Aren't things slightly better, even though it's tumultuous? Like, uh, at on this, like, don't we have to exercise the demons in order to move forward as a society? Like, that's what I'm trying to get somebody's perspective who was around, like, more cognizant when I wasn't. Like, are you seeing a positive trend, even though on the surface things are on literally on fire?
Well, I think this is, knock on wood, a case of things have to get worse before they get better, like a catharsis or an exorcism, kind of like what you just said. Um, I, I gotta look. We gotta look at it up. At least to some optimism that despite the, even in spite of all these things, I've seen an increased amount of solidarity amongst even some very unlikely groups of people. And that's encouraging to see. And I like to see that traction as well. What scares me is, of course, the backlash. I think Wendy's last night, or was it last night? Is something to be fearful of, because I unfortunately think that these bigoted cops are going to backlash with some nasty stuff, and I think that Wendy's, incident was a clear example. I also worry, okay, let's say Trump gets voted out of office. That's some definite progress there. But then he's got, roughly 2 months to really go bananas.
They're lame. They're lame duck.
I'm reminded of this guy's got his,
I think if he loses, he'd be considered lame duck for his last 2 months, and anything he tried to push would either get overturned by I don't think if he loses, I don't think the Republican Senate would support him in those lame duck months. So I don't that's not as much of a concern in that they're already starting to pull support from him. So if anything, Mitt Romney, there is a very strong argument for people on the left. If we would take any lessons from the right wing, is that we should start a campaign for Mitt Romney to challenge Trump from the right, so it splits the right wing. This is the left wing plays too nice. We don't when we're going against a guerrilla warfare tactic party, we can't play nice and expect to win, because that's how you win the popular vote and end up losing the fucking election. And that's what I'm saying.
Right.
There's all these things about the whole reason I say that is because I pay attention to the right wing. There's a lot of infighting happening on the right wing, but the left wing never capitalized on it, is what I'm getting at. That's kind of where
Mitt Romney and Obama were very similar.
They were
not a whole lot of remarkably similar. ACA was Romney Care.
For universal
it was Romney Care repackaged for the country. Yeah, exactly. And a lot of the policies that he promoted and signed into legislation in Massachusetts were fairly, we look at them now, they'd be very liberal policy.
Yep, exactly. And that's the thing. People have to look at policy and not just be persuaded by what people call themselves, because somebody will call themselves a Democrat and be, have far right-wing policy, but just because they wear blue, you'll say, oh, I'll vote blue, because that's the mantra when people are trained not to look at policy. And then these people, that's how the parties have been subverted, is by that very notion of voting blue no matter what, even if their policy is right-wing. So that's what I'm saying, Ryan. Do you, because I see teenagers and young people being more active and aware and less deceived by the wolves in Democrats' clothing. Because that's where, again, I can see a Republican, even if they call themselves a Democrat. Obama was a Republican, but people still think he was a center right Republican.
They try to call him a moderate. They try to call him a moderate Democrat.
Yeah, he just called himself a Democrat. He was not a Democrat. I mean, he was a Democrat because he called himself that, but he wasn't on the left wing, is what I'm getting at. So that's what I'm saying. I don't know how I hate to use political definitions because they're antiquated, but do you see people being more socially active in ways that are more effective than 30 years ago? Because I was not super cognizant in the 90s, but I feel like that. Am I crazy for feeling that?
I think the biggest, best thing that happened to the left was technology. And it is just increasingly harder for these scumbags to hide. Mm-hmm. It only takes a second anymore. And, people are like, well, why is this happening so often now? It's always been happening. We just didn't have cameras that uploaded to the internet that fast, that everyone could see. And I think technology has really done a lot to kind of expose and also hinder, because let's don't forget election rigging, and that's probably a whole different Sunday for you guys. But But I think overall, though, and I'm not saying that the left's necessarily more educated, but
I think they quantifiably are. I don't think that's even a question.
Yeah.
I think the left is quantifiably more educated than the right wing.
Yeah,
So I don't want to. I don't want to give the right wing credit when they don't deserve it, because the left wing, it's like the problem is then, because the people in charge of the economy are anti-intellectuals, they've put people with education in positions where we have to be subservient to a gig economy. So then they can point at us and ridicule us for saying, "Oh, look at you with your master's degree having to go do this stupid shit. I bet you wish you became a plumber now." So there's this whole element of like, yes, the left wing is quantifiably more educated, but it's there was this. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. What's interesting is, going back to Romney's digital campaign was a joke. I mean, it was laughable. I remember memes about it that, like, he just had tweets that were awkward, and he just got crushed just over that alone, on top of everything else. But also, after that, the left has been really good at exploiting the internet and using it to an advantage, and very much so now. And the right wing realized this, and that's why they outsourced all their IT and campaigning to Russia, to people that were living in conditions that didn't care as long as they could make some money. In bad conditions that didn't care so they could make some money. And so they recognized their failure after Romney. Okay, we're getting creamed in computer stuff, so we need to hire guys that can do computer stuff. And then there you go. And a lot of it's speculative, probably what I'm saying, but I that stood out to me quite a bit.
Well, no, it's definitely speculative, but based on my experience in cybersecurity and with people of different, like, national cybersecurity specialists in different countries, what you're saying is fairly accurate concerning the most logical explanation as to what happened. It wasn't that Vladimir Putin came in and made some executive decision to interfere. The right wing went and outsourced this shit because they weren't good at it. And that's how Russians and Ukrainians got involved. What you just said is one of the most accurate and most logical explanations as to why people, like, need to stay away from speculating about shit that they don't understand. Because when you have all these people talking about Putin making all these, like, it's not that Putin doesn't get involved. Of course, governments get involved, but that level of involvement isn't even necessary. The explanation you gave is so much more logical, much more provable, and much more in line with reality than some nefarious, like, my issue with the Putin element is, if he's going to interfere with the right wing, he's going to interfere with the left wing. So it kind of cancels out.
Yeah,
like,
Putin's not interfering with one or the other. He's interfering with America if he's doing it at all.
Exactly. He's interfering with everything. So acting like he's interfering to benefit one side over the other is like disingenuous, and it plays into the team politics element of, oh, this is just the other side working to hurt my side, when in reality, if we're saying Vladimir Putin's special interests are aligned with one party, that doesn't understand Russian politics right there. That person doesn't understand how Russia operates. So that's why, again, it's like, if we're putting in the Putin element, we have to then say it affects both sides equally, and then take it out of the equation altogether. But what you just said as to why there's Russian involvement on the right wing side is super logical and legitimately provable, because all of these organizations are going to have, like, records of them contracting out this stuff to, like, Ukrainian organizations and Ukrainian companies. And it's like, that shit, a lot of people could go find those records, like, today.
I got a message just a bit ago from a friend of mine who said,
I'm gonna let you guys go too, because I'm my device is dying. So,
hey, thanks for
Thanks
calling
for
in,
calling
man.
brother.
So
great talking to you guys. Great show. I'll be listening. Thanks.
yeah, man. So I just got a message from a friend of mine who is listening, and they mentioned that these are wings of the same bird. And I've actually seen that meme. Or who was it? Ice T, or I think it was Ice T who said, "Don't associate me with that party bullshit because they're both wings of the same bird." I think that's a pretty accurate metaphor at this point. We're talking about the neoliberal machine at work. Its entire job is to convince people to choose one of the two options, and that any other option is just unacceptable. Mostly because it doesn't fall in line with keeping the machine running. But it's all about presenting a scenario where you're going to have to choose between a series of limited options, which makes me wonder about, like free will and actual participation in any of this stuff. Do we really have a choice? Your choices are to participate or to not participate, and which leads to eventual disenfranchisement. And I think that's like a very dangerous slackline to walk on. It's really easy to fall off or become just completely put off by this whole process we've got.
Well, and I think you've nailed on something too concerning participation in that there's a group of people who have been conditioned to think that voting is the pinnacle and the only way to participate in this country if you're not in government. So that's why those will be like the same people to claim to be liberal, but also shame the protesters, um, the ones that are burning
Focusing on the
down shit.
protests,
'Cause again,
they're focusing on the rioting and the looting, and they're not focusing on the
yeah,
reason that the protest even begins.
exactly. So
Yeah,
those people are, I want to call them pseudo liberals now because they're not really liberal
pseudo liberal.
because they are more concerned with property than actual social justice. And at the end of the day, when those, like, so a lot of people may, I don't know how many people are listening, are friends with me on Facebook. There's people who I grew up having as teachers and guidance counselors who I'm friends with Facebook, who I will have debates with. So I've had ongoing debates with a middle school guidance counselor who, she's white. She's, like, it's like one of those things where I'm trying to explain to her when I was a teenager destroying shit at the school, why that's me doing the same thing to destroy property to try to get people's attention, the same way these people are destroying property to try to get other people's attention because the property is the only thing they care about, or that's how the person perceives it. Like if I'm a person who perceives property being valued more than my life, I'm going to destroy that property to get your attention to say, hey, guess what? You can fucking replace that thing. I'm not replaceable. And this is one of those things that she got it immediately because she has empathy as an individual. But the people who claim to be liberal, who need that explained to them 17 million times and still don't get it, those people aren't liberal. They just want to claim to be liberal because they don't want to be openly racist. They don't want to be openly identified as right wingers because there's social ostracism that comes with that now.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't want that social ostracism from certain elements. It's like what it comes down to is mostly hot people are left wing. Let's call it what it is. It's not that we have better genes, it's that we take care of ourselves better. We're the ones wearing the mask.
Yeah.
We're the ones washing our hands. We're the ones washing our bodies. We're the ones cutting our hair.
We're the ones staying
We're
home.
hotter. Guess what? We're hotter than the right-wing people because the right-wing people don't fucking care about themselves. Let's call it what it is. So then the people who want to be left-wing they just want to have access to the left-wing pool, and that's what it comes down to. So they'll play left-wing because they want to have sex with left-wing people. I can call it out because I'm not desperate and I don't need to like beat around the bush and not call out those people because I'm one of them. Guess what? I'm not one of those people, so fucking call out those people that are going out to protest just to use it to get laid next year.
Well, that's always happened. There's always been people who wanted to go hang out with hippies because they wanted to get laid.
But they didn't get called out as easy now.
That's true.
We didn't have a social network to fucking point at him and be like, this is a trope.
Yeah.
That dude is unoriginal. He's just going to take pictures so he can post it on his Facebook thing and then use it on Tinder next year to try to fucking hook up with some chick. Be like, oh yeah, Black Lives Matter. Can we fuck now? Because that's how it's gonna look next year.
I feel like that's been going on the whole time. I remember one time my uncle who died recently, when his daughter finally had that breakthrough and found personal identity and freedom for herself to have her own ideas and that kind of thing, and she was gonna leave Kansas, and he said, "Oh, go out to California, be a hippie for a year." And it occurred to me, and it's like, man, he was the kind of guy that went to the party because he wanted to hook up with chicks that he couldn't actually talk to in real life. And I think like with the political class, we've been watching and experiencing a giant exodus from conservatism because those people don't want to be aligned with the racists and white supremacists and neo-Nazis that have taken over the Republican wing. And so the only place left for them is the Democratic wing, because the progressives on the leftists, can't see my air quotes, the leftists are too extreme and too radical for them, and they misidentify Antifa as something that it's not, and so we're stuck with a bunch of people who don't want to be associated with that. And it's like the meme going around. It's sure there are a lot of Republicans who aren't racist, but they also voted for Trump, and by extension they're okay with that, with his brand of xenophobia.
Racist.
They are.
That meme is like just trying to excuse people who aren't wearing fucking Klan robes.
But that's what I mean. It's they might say they're not, but they're okay with it. Those are the fence sitters. Those are the people that have always been there watching it happen, but not saying anything, not doing anything, even though they are witness to the collapse of their communities. And that's a problem. That people think that it's also an expression of privilege that people can just ignore shit and pretend that, oh, it doesn't bother me. But we know that it does. There's a ripple effect. There is the entropic cascade of economic activity that occurs when we've got entire groups of people being castigated or being punished for something that's genetic lottery.
Well, and I think there's this notion that we can decide if we're racist, or we can decide if we're misogynist, or we can decide if we're transphobic. That's not how that shit works.
Yeah.
That's not how that shit works. If I'm telling somebody they're being racist, they don't get to decide if what they said is fucking racist. I'm telling them they're racist. If someone tells someone that they're being transphobic, that person does not then get to decide if what they just did was transphobic or not. And that's where there's this element of people thinking they can decide retroactively how their actions affected someone else.
I'm pretty sure that's like that's fundamental to mansplaining or white splaining,
or transplaining, or gay splaining, or whatever, because like if it's not about being cis, hetero, and black, like as a man, I'm not gonna try to tell people how that shit is. It's not my lane. I stay the fuck out of their lane.
Yeah.
And that's it's like super easy for me not to tell somebody about their own experience. I don't get how that's so difficult for other people.
So
there's this. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, Ryan Schilling just commented, and it's a quote from Elie Wiesel. It says, I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented.
And we got to stop limiting that shit to animals too.
Yeah.
Or to humans, because the animals and the plants are being seen as unimportant, cast aside, and subject to being just destroyed as if they're not part of our habitat. And I think that's kind of where like we have such a problem treating humans equally. Me asking for people to treat animals and plants equally, that sounds like some utopian bullshit right now. But in 20 years, it's gonna sound normal. Kids are gonna sound like the people that don't think that the way that I'm talking about now are going to sound stupid to the kids growing up now because they have great examples. Like, it's crazy to me. I shared this thing with you about how they're now discussing potentially making James Kirk as a character. It's not a real person, a fictional character, bisexual. People are losing their minds because they want him to be
Oh,
heterosexual,
that's
not
right.
not acknowledging that he's already fucked different species in the
Yeah,
first place.
straight up.
Somebody who's fucking different species isn't heterosexual. That's not the same.
No,
Like
no, that
that's
was
not hetero people.
that was so funny when you shared that with me. Like the first thing that came into mind was like, did people forget that he like bedded down with a woman from Gemini in the
Yeah,
in the
dude.
original series, or that he's literally all about going where no man has gone before? That's like the essence of exploration in Star Wars or Star Trek. They go places where no one has gone before, and part of that is interspecies relationship, and part of that also is the potential to have a truly intimate relationship with someone from another planet who's not even human, and who knows if they even have the same construct of gender that we have. That's like a super colonial
So,
imposition to put on another species from another planet. It's like, oh yeah, by the way, are you male or female? And
bro, so on those lines, like I'm gonna say um genetic or equality of gender and gender fluidity acceptance is in my genes. And the reason I say that is gonna it sounds crazy at first, but the reason I say that is because I've learned from my travels and from other relatives that I'm supposed, like, not me, but our family's supposed to have some connections to the Igbo tribe. So that's interesting to me, like, for the reason that once I started learning about the Igbo is that apparently they've had a concept called umuna, which is basically a patrilineal line that recognizes like male lineage, but it also recognizes gender fluidity. So it's like they have the notion of gender separation, but they also allowed for like transgender people in their tribe. So this is something that the Igbo have accepted before colonialism. Like every African tribe isn't like that, but learning that the one I'm supposed to be connected to already had acceptance of gender fluidity in their culture makes me 100% in line with like I I felt resistance to like give my credence to equality to like Western liberal culture. And guess what? Apparently it's in my fucking blood. And that's where I'm like, I'm not trying to take away from liberal movement and liberal progress, but liberals want to like make white savior everything because they don't know enough about other people's history to know that, like, guess what? Gender fluidity existed in African cultures too. It wasn't just Native Americans that had gender fluidity. They had it in the Igbo tribe. And the more I'm learning about my DNA and my connection to my, like, I didn't learn it through ancestry DNA. I learned it through one of the crazy things I'm learning as I get older is that your DNA tells you when you're from somewhere. Like you
oh
don't have
yeah,
to fuck like ancestry DNA can't tell me more than my DNA can.
when I went to
I just have to
China,
listen to it.
when I went to China, I didn't look like anybody in the north on the eastern seaboard.
So you felt that shit. You felt
Yeah,
like you weren't from there.
yeah. And then the further south I got, the more similar the facial structures became, the more familiar the food became, and
You
finally when we
feel it,
ended up
man. You
in
feel it in your blood.
yeah, and finally when we ended up in Hong Kong, I saw people who had the same kind of eyes, the same cheekbones, same jawline, similar people that looked like my uncles and my mother, my aunts, people that looked familiar. It was really surreal
Yeah.
because I finally was able to blend into a crowd instead of standing out.
Yeah, because there's times when I was in Nigeria and I'd look at some lady and I'm like, it was like looking at my mom and I'm like, what the fuck is going on? It's crazy. And it's like, the facial features in some regions are just so distinct from other regions where you're like, you know, I look at a lot of Ethiopians and I'm like, oh, I'm no like that's nothing near my genetic line. But like my dad, like he looks like he could be from Morocco. But if I like, and it's like we have the same genes to an extent, but I got I got my dad's and my mom's genes, obviously, but the genes that got expressed from me, it's like I don't identify with the Moroccan people at all. But you look at some people from there, you'd be like, oh, that's him. Like they look, and then it's like the same shit with the Ottoman Empire. I know in my blood there's somebody in my family that came from the Ottoman Empire. I don't need some fucking ancestry.com to tell me that shit. I don't know where, but it's somewhere in the Ottoman Empire, and I can feel that shit when I lived in Turkey, and like felt the connection with the land where it's like you you have to be able to trust yourself and trust your instincts more than somebody else. That's
Yeah.
some weird ass shit to me that somebody would trust a scientist's assessment of their DNA better than their own. Like, I don't even know if I'll ever get my DNA shit done. I don't really care because every time I connect with the land somewhere, it feels like it feels like magic in a way where you're like, it don't happen everywhere, and that's how I know it's real. In that there's certain things I'm not even going to discuss because it'll sound made up, but I experienced it, so I don't need anybody else's validation.
Yeah.
When you connect with your DNA heritage, it's magic. The only way to describe it is magic, and the way that I've experienced it, I don't even care to discuss it, but I want people to understand that shit is way more magical and way more valid than a fucking DNA test ever will be. And it's like, yeah, you can use a DNA test to start, but until you like walk the path of the where your DNA came from, you'll never understand what I'm talking about. Because what I realized, like I've been thinking about this, it's like your body is both a key and a machine in that your machine is constantly evolving and constantly updating and upgrading itself. But when you walk in a path where your DNA unlocks your connection to that surrounding, it's like a magical download of genetic information that is legitimate. Your DNA has cellular memory. This isn't out of the realm of science. Like DNA memory is real in the same way that you can inherit trauma, you can inherit joy, and you can inherit connection with things. And that's like, those are the things that have been disconnected by capitalism so that then they can sell them back to you in a packaged way that is not even the real connection that you have to work to get. Like you have to put your DNA through the genetic
So
cog to unlock the
yeah.
machine.
So
To
Ryan
download it.
Schilling commented that that DNA sequencing is one way that these companies are obtaining copyright over genetic
Yep.
sequencing,
Yep.
and of course they say that it's so they can develop better medicines, but at the end of the day they still have the copyright to that genetic sequence, and that's
And when
actually a
people
very dangerous
buy,
thing.
I don't think people realize when they buy
They're paying for the
an
privilege.
interpretation of their DNA, they're selling the license to the copyright of their DNA to that company, which is
Hmm.
why then they can then use that for law enforcement reference to then see if your your DNA comes up in reference to a crime.
Yeah.
And then if your cousin or somebody related to you is the criminal. They can use your DNA to track down that person as like the match on which they're gonna go through that person's trash and test their DNA against that to be like,
Yep.
yep, this is the one. And
Yeah.
people sell that, or they're paying that to give that right away, and they don't read the fine print. This is where the terms of service, like, people will just take convenience for uh, giving away their rights and then scream about First Amendment when they gave away their First Amendment right in a terms of service thing they didn't read.
Yeah.
It's like the craziest shit.
We got another comment about this, the DNA thing, is that or ancestry rather, is that it's the way we realize our DNA and essentially cleanse ourselves in the process. And I think that's a really beautiful outlook on it. It allows us to reestablish those ancestral bonds and to become closer to who we are or who we're supposed to be. And
Exactly. And I think, you can't understand who you're supposed to be without understanding where you came from to understand what makes you. Like, that's like saying, oh, if somebody has a meal and they don't understand any contents of what constitutes that meal, saying that meal was good is effectively useless because they don't even know what's in it. And there's this element of not understanding, you don't need to understand every aspect of where you came from to understand who you are, but you can't understand all of yourself without understanding where you came from. And that's like an unfortunate side effect of being an amalgamation of things. Nobody came from a vacuum.
there are some people now that I think there's a concern with CRISPR and designer babies, because now we can do dramatic gene editing, and I feel like that crosses into eugenics in a lot of ways, and I think that it's eventually going to invite a really complex conundrum where we have, it's like the emergence of a new class of citizen humans, ones that who are genetically predisposed to have fantastic vision or a larger liver because their family wants to make beer or wine, and so they need to be able to live longer while drinking all the time or something. That's probably
You know
really
why that's
hyperbolic.
scary? Because then you're inferior. That's the only thing you're scared of as a Homo sapien. I feel it too, because we become obsolete. That's why we're scared of that.
Yeah.
But guess what? That's apparently what humans are supposed to be doing. We develop this cognitive perceptive capacity to develop the tools to modify our genes so we're not subject to the whims of natural selection. We are artificial selection. We define artificial selection, but want to pretend everything we do is natural for the sake of deluding ourselves into connecting ourselves to something that we are now inherently disconnected from because of our dependence. And that's why, on the one hand, I agree with what you're saying. I don't even disagree with what you're saying. It's that understanding that as someone who is a Homo sapien, there is going to be a more superior iteration of our species. Well, it won't technically be our species then.
No, they'll be
The
different.
next iteration will make us inferior. That is supposed to biologically scare us.
Yeah.
Like, our biology would not be working if we weren't scared by that notion. So I think that's where our emotional understanding of how evolution works is meant to make us override that disconnect to say that, yeah, we're scared of it, but the only way we're going to survive as a species is if we evolve. We can't limit our evolution because we're scared of evolution.
Oh, I'm not necessarily afraid of the evolution.
Oh, I didn't say you. And I'm saying
like,
that
sign me up for cybernetic
audience.
augmentation and wearable augmented reality technology and all that kind of stuff. I think my real concern is that there will be special laws created around humans, around Homo sapiens, around the genetic predecessor to whatever the most advanced version of this is. Because I don't think that everyone's going to be able to afford this. I don't think that it's going to be the kind of thing.
They're not.
It's going to be a small population, and eventually they're going to have. I mean, they will have advantages. They might have enhanced cognitive abilities. They might have enhanced strength or speed or endurance or any of those things that we want to see in like Olympic athletes. And so my concern is that, well, are they going to put a little hashtag on their records and says, CRISPR Olympian or CRISPR geneticist or CRISPR whatever, or are we going to have, like, are there going to be special laws for people who aren't CRISPR? It's like, hey, by the way, you can't do these things because you lack the genetic predisposition to be able to do these things. And that might be a good thing. We want people, if somebody out there can breathe a chlorine gas rich environment and not die, but we want those people to be able to work in that kind of environment. We don't want people who can't do that. They'll die. So there are some protections that might be good, but I'm just my immediate concern is that these things will be leveraged in a way that is not beneficial.
I mean, I don't disagree with you. It's just a matter of the problem with that framing is then I'll counter frame it. Should a species that is murderous, destructive, inefficient, ineffective with their technology, should that species be preserved for the sake of their comfort in the face of a species that is more efficient, more effective with its technology, less murderous, ethically inclined by its genetic design? Should the other species be protected for the sake of equality when that superior species has been created specifically to be superior? I think that's a moral dilemma.
No, that is.
That as the inferior species, we kind of got to accept, like, hey, we can't protect the fucking murderous monkeys in the light of the ethical robots.
I think
monkeys are uncomfortable.
I think that you've just touched upon the whole, like, we don't deserve this place.
We don't.
Notion. We can't even coexist with animals that are peaceful. We have to alter their development over the course of tens of thousands of years so we can eat them, because for some reason over the last 200,000 years humans haven't found a better source of protein.
Because I have to look at it from the perspective, if I was a type 3 civilization and I just happened upon this planet,
fucking ignore the place.
I had the choice of giving this planet advanced technology in its current state. If my lifespan was unfathomable to people's imaginations, and I had just been observing this planet for 37 years, the same amount of time that I've been alive, and I had to sit here and decide if after that 37 years, if this species was worthy of our technology, I'd laugh at that notion.
Well,
I'd consider whether this species deserved to keep existing, and whether I should move on and acknowledge them as trash or not acknowledge them at all. I don't think the human species is even worthy of being acknowledged by a type 3 civilization, let alone being considered of getting our fucking technology right now.
I think if we were a type 3 civilization looking at Earth, my immediate reaction would be to place this solar system and a huge chunk of, actually probably this galaxy, but to place it in a time dilation field, basically a small artificial black hole, one that would prevent them from escaping, but put some kind of observation portal in place so that if they ever decided to get their heads out of their asses and stop being so brutal and homicidal, there would be a way to recognize when that happened, and to reserve secondary judgment for a later date, because there's a chance that humanity might figure itself out, but on the path that we've been on for the last 200,000 years, it's hard to imagine that things are really going to change like that. I mean, there was an entire 190 something thousand years leading up to what we call civilization, where people were just barbarous. They killed each other.
Sorry. No, I think that's correct in that, when you look at it took 40 years for us to get out of the heliopause, and when the Voyager got to the heliopause, it like seemingly got stuck. That theory is not out of line with our difficulty getting out of our solar system. So that's where I'm like, yeah, man, I'm of the same mind in that, yeah, just this species is, how do I put it? It's in an infantile stage, but because we have fancy technology, the species has an overinflated sense of self, and everybody in the species, not everybody, a lot of people in the species think that we're not just cave people with iPhones, but that's kind of what we are.
I mean,
Like, we can't get along with ourselves. We have no business
most
going
people
off planet yet.
I feel like most people could figure out how to use a pocket knife, but I'm going to say that 99.999 repeating couldn't make their own pocket knife.
Oh God, no.
And
Oh God, no.
and so I don't even want to extend that metaphor to the technology that we have at our fingertips, because I know how hard it is to code an application. It's not easy if you don't have a considerable amount of training and experience, and are fluent in multiple programming languages. But I doubt that I don't even want to guess at the percentage of the population that is represented as coders who can actually not just deliver the software, but compile their own operating system, and then develop the fabrication and layout topology for the circuitry necessary to bring that into reality, and then figure out what materials are necessary to create the device itself, and then make it affordable and quick to produce. Because I'm pretty sure that is a team effort, and there is no one person that could ever do it all on their own. Like technology.
No, you're right. And it's funny you should mention that. I think this is a good segue to start discussing building machines. We don't have to limit it to one type of machine, but the notion of building machines, period. In that when a person builds their own machine, there is an intrinsic tie to that machine that is not created when you purchase that machine. And I think that as an example, when people are building computers, it's like the modern day equivalent of hot rod culture.
Oh, yeah.
That you can't necessarily get because modern cars are too, what's the word? They're too much a combination of mechanical engineering and computer technology, so that only a very small sliver of people can actually work on them. Like, you have to be a mechanical engineer and a computer literate person to work on modern cars, whereas like 50 years ago you could just be a mechanical engineer to work on a car. And now a person building a computer, you don't have to necessarily even be a coder to build a computer, because the way that they come, a lot of times you're just uploading the operating system and putting the machine itself together. In that if a person is building a car, they don't necessarily build the engine. They may install the engine block, but they're not building the engine necessarily. Yeah. So when people talk about building machines, there's all these different levels at which you can approach building a machine.
But most of the time it's modular assembly.
Building it.
Most of the time it's modular assembly.
Yeah.
Component assembly, component compilation. I've been assembling my own computers for the better part of 2 decades, and at this point, I'm fearless. I'll open up laptops, I'll open up cell phones, I'll open up practically anything, because I feel confident that I can get in there without damaging anything inside of it. I also have a small and I say small, but it's not actually that small, toolkit of special tools with very tiny tips that allow me to access these things. And you're right, it is hot rod culture. If in the slideshow today, I included a series of images of old supercomputers and modern supercomputers, and then with our consumer culture, we've actually managed to do a few things right. The GPU never would have had the same kind of development put into it had gamers not demanded faster frame rates and greater resolution and greater color accuracy and less tearing. And so now you got people with their home computer setups that are rivaling the power of supercomputers from 2 decades ago.
Yep.
And it's insane. Like the kind of machines that were necessary for geographical modeling or geological modeling, that can, like 20, 30 years ago, that can be had for $400 or $500 worth of video card. That's insane to me. And then, like, man, our handheld devices. My phone, I've got like the lowest level iPhone that exists, but that thing is more capable than probably the first 5 laptops that I had, maybe even more. And it just blows my mind what we can do with technology these days. It's like people take for granted having access to the repository of human knowledge and experience. We spend most of our time, it seems like everyone is arguing about the wrong things. And it's like earlier we were talking about people getting mad about protesters instead of the reason that they're protesting. It's all off track. And we've got so many cool opportunities too. I remember when I was little, I think one of my uncles said is like, get into computing. They're doing some amazing things with computers these days. And that's always stuck around in my head because, computers, a computer is the reason that we're doing this show. Computers are all around us. They enable us to communicate through containment protocol where we shouldn't be leaving the house and interacting with other people, but we can still maintain these high-level dialogues, and we can still engage people who are paying attention, who want to have a higher level dialogue.
Well, and we wouldn't have had that capacity without technology in a way that I'm trying to think of, like, if the pandemic had happened in like 1980, 85, or even the early 90s, the difference in information movement that would have happened. And, I feel like the conspiracies would have been way worse and way more out of control, even though they seem bad now. I just have to think.
I remember IRC and IRQ channels, and the conspiracies definitely existed back then. They were rampant back then. I think the real difference between now and then is social networking and social media.
I'm talking about pre-internet.
No, that's what I mean. Like, those things always existed, but the thing that the internet gave everyone else was the ability to find each other. So now the conspiracy people can find each other more readily. They can share their ideas more readily, and then they can develop their own internal hierarchy of who has the greatest clarity to divine the true intent of the conspiracy. But those things have always existed. There's always...
Well, I'm not talking about the conspiracies not existing. I'm saying when there's no internet in which people can readily fact check, the conspiracies stay like this is gonna like for the longest time, a large part of America thought Richard Gere had a hamster in his ass, because it's not that they were that fucking stupid, is that it wasn't that easy to like get on the internet and fact check stuff. So like for like a long period of time, a large part of America thought that one of the New Kids on the Block got a blowjob on stage, or that Marilyn Manson got his ribs removed so he could give himself fellatio. Like, there's all these things that Americans used to believe that are stupid as fuck now because they couldn't fact check like simple shit where you're like, oh, that's dumb, that's really stupid. But it becomes like the rumor mill in America used to let way, way dumber rumors get, like, the notion of 5G causing like health effects. That's not that that's not that crazy of a conspiracy.
No.
Like in
It's
reality,
actually really tame compared
like
to some of them.
Marilyn Manson removing his fucking ribs to suck his own dick. That's a stupid ass conspiracy. That used to be something that was really like common. So that's what I'm saying. Yeah, you have conspiracy theories always existed, but the level of stupidity at which the conspiracies would like be so far from the realm of reality and how many people would believe them is like that's how you get this shit with like wacko jacko stuff
Yeah.
where it's like, oh, Michael Jackson sleeps in a
A hyperbaric chamber.
hyperbolic chamber or some shit. It's like, yeah, he probably actually had one, but he didn't probably sleep in it every
Well, no,
night.
he there's a very real rationalization for why he had a hyperbaric chamber installed at Neverland, and it's during, I think it was in the 90s. He was doing a Pepsi commercial, and one of the gels melted and caught on fire and landed on his head,
Right.
and it scorched his scalp, and he was, rushed to an emergency room, and to speed up his recovery they placed him in a clean room. They put him in a hyperbaric chamber that was free of all contaminants and bacteria, so that his scalp would have the greatest chance of being restored, because the guy was known for being beautiful and having great hair and this face and all this stuff. And we know that he had a skin condition that required he wore makeup for a long time. And
Vitiligo.
yeah, and over the course of his career, he just became lighter and lighter skinned. And so
People thought he bleached his skin. That
yeah,
was
that's another
stupid ass
fucking
rumor.
bullshit. Exactly, because they didn't know the complexity of his life and what was actually going on. And so yeah, he had that for legitimate medical necessity, because he wanted to be healed, and he could afford it because he had the resources. So yeah, man, that whole thing was so weird.
But again, that's what I mean in the in terms of like how the conspiracy theories then pre-internet
Yeah,
were just like so far out of the realm of reality. But you'd have random people's moms and dads discussing that as if it's real, or the kind of shit that was in that realm of the absurd as if it was real, and now those are fringe. Those
yeah,
people are fringe,
yeah.
which
Oh,
is why it's like when we know when somebody's fringe now, but before, Americans could not tell when they were on the fringe and discussing some dumbass fringe theory because they couldn't fact check quick enough.
yeah. One of our randos, Tim Lukasik, he points out that Manson rumor came from a female performance artist who came out on stage dressed as Manson, and Manson performed fellatio on a dildo that she was wearing, and the rumor mill churned and went with it.
Yeah, so people who are listening know what I'm talking about. It's not like I'm making that shit up. Those, again, there's all these random rumors that would float around when you're a kid, and there was no Wikipedia or there's no IMDb to go fact check that shit and be like, yeah, no, Richard Gere never put a fucking hamster in his ass. Like, no, that didn't happen.
Man, that's
I mean, South Park did a whole show about it.
yeah, but South Park does all sorts of strange
But I'm saying
rumor-based
that that's
shows.
the ubiquity
Yeah,
of
it's true.
that rumor about how much that rumor was ingrained in American
How far
culture.
it had reached.
Yeah,
Bless South Park for bringing conspiracy theories to the surface. They also, they also did their work to dismantle, what was it, Scientology,
hmm
and they lost a career performer on the show. They lost
Isaac Hayes.
Isaac
Yeah,
Hayes, because he was Scientologist, and didn't want to stand for his people being subjugated and castigated by the producers of South Park. And so on some level, more power to you, but also like, man, really, Scientology is going to be the sword you fall on?
yeah,
Really?
seriously. Well, and it's funny to think about how powerful Scientology used to be and how much that has fallen thanks to Anonymous and South Park partially. Like it's very easy to forget how they were of. I mean, they haven't gone away completely. They're still powerful relatively, but they were way more powerful as an institution in the early '90s. And it's like that Dianetics shit was everywhere,
Oh
man. You
yeah.
couldn't go anywhere without hearing about Dianetics this, Dianetics that, and your thetan levels or whatever. And like, it was a very, it's unsettling how popular that cult got.
But then you have to
In
surrender
that,
to Xenu, and eventually,
remember Battlefield Earth?
God, that's so fucking terrible. I tried
Oof,
to
that
read
movie
that
was terrible.
once, and I couldn't
Oh
get.
my
I tried.
god.
I seriously tried to read it because it's like, huh, this is a science fiction movie that came from a novel, and I was really into sci-fi literature at the time, like really, really voraciously into it, and so I couldn't even get past the first chapter. I just like, it was like, what the is this shit? I don't even really. All I remember is there were some aliens who came to Earth and were enslaving people, and it was like the weirdest version of Spartacus. I think that's like the only thing I could even compare it to. It was some colonialists, some imperial bullshit, and some human savior story. Like one person is going to be able to take out an intergalactic race of aliens, and that's like the scariest part. Like we've got a whole culture that's waiting for a savior. Not too long
Mhm.
ago, I did this analysis of Star Wars and the Galactic Republic, and I get to the end of my analysis, my primary analysis, and it's like, you know what? We're at the end of Rogue One. We're about to start a New Hope, but we don't actually have there's no New Hope. And we're not going to get one. And it's part of that is because the whole concept of a savior is flawed.
Right.
We'd have to there's no one person that's gonna save us all. And I think that's part of the great lie of religion is so many of them are based around the story of the one. And I love the Matrix. We've talked about the Matrix endlessly on this show, but at the same time, like it's not just one person. Neo couldn't have accomplished what he accomplished without the rest of the people of Zion.
Yep.
um, Yeshua had his disciples, and they were an incredibly big part of the whole system that they were trying to establish to free people. And this goes like all the way back, like every story of the one, there were more people who were part of that equation.
Hell, the Holy Trinity isn't even one.
Yeah.
Even in Christianity, they talk about having a fucking monotheistic God. Like, no, motherfucker, y'all got three.
Yeah.
And they try to act like they're a single entity, like, but then act like they're not a single entity.
You can't have
Like,
it
you
both
can't have the
ways.
Son of God and also have the God not be the Son of God. That doesn't make any mathematical sense.
Well, what that really reveals is that God is talking to himself when they have conversations. He's just sitting there talking to
Supposedly.
himself, and I mean, if that's the case, if he is, and so here's a guy who believes that he created all of existence, who talks to himself on a regular basis.
Hmm.
I think I just described a schizophrenic person.
Yep, I've been saying. I mean, the whole story of Abraham and Isaac is schizophrenic in the first place.
Yeah.
I've been saying for a very long time that there's an argument that there's a potential, if there's not multiple uh, iterations of what would be considered a species that pretend to be the same thing, like, or something that is a, if it's a deity, then it's got schizophrenia. There's only a couple like actual explanations as to why the Abraham and Isaac story played out the way it did. It's like Yahweh is almost like surprised that the fucking sacrifice is gonna happen in the way where it's almost like he didn't tell he didn't order the sacrifice, or he didn't realize he ordered it. And that's kind of where, again, it's like there's something I that story always stood out to me from even the point when I read it as a kid. But the more I learn about different religious perspectives of deities and creation, and even different perspectives of what we call Christianity and the entities within it, like monotheism, I think is more a byproduct of um, like a religious order or a king or a group needing a more hierarchical, authoritative culture that's more easily disseminated through religion than through the sword. Like it's easier to create hierarchical authority through Christianity than through threatening every single person with physical violence.
I think it also passes the buck. It allows
Yep,
a
exactly.
controlling entity to say, "Oh, well, it's not us. This is ordained by
This
God."
is your retribution because
Yeah,
you sinned. Even
yeah.
though I didn't know what you did, God knows what you did, and you sinned behind closed doors. So that's why you're suffering, and that's why you need to give me your money.
Oh man, that's like that's the great kick in the pants with the COVID situation is there are all these televangelists who have multi-million-dollar estates that are paid for by televised donation requests, and they're standing there telling people that, oh, cast out the sinner and stuff like that. I think there's a meme out there that, or maybe it's a Twitter quote where this person says that they've always been told, love the sinner, not the sin, and the mathematical proof to that would be love the believer, not the belief. And I think that's one of those things that it's hard. I think it's hard for people to come to that conclusion because when it's framed as the sinner, we tend to focus on the person that is being told they're doing something wrong, and then we forget that there's a person who's saying, "Hey, this is wrong," without asking why does this person think that it's wrong, and then
Right.
and then we lose real objectivity at that point, which is actually a topic for another discussion: the differences between objectivity and subjectivity, and whether or not it's objectivity is even real.
Yeah, that's a whole existential conversation. But in that, I think you know, empathy is one of those things where um, if you can try to be objective from another perspective, then you're practicing empathy. And I think that's kind of where, like, it you feel like empathy is trying to be subjective when really I believe it's trying to be objective from a different perspective, and that there's like a slightly different emphasis in that. Um, I want to believe that empathy obviously is meant to understand how someone is feeling, but if you can't understand their logical thought process, then you can't understand why they're feeling that way. So,
Mm.
on the one hand, it seems like when people are like, "Oh, I can't imagine how you feel." Of course not. So you should try to imagine why I feel this way and not how I feel. And that's kind of where we've been mistrained in how we approach empathy to try to feel other people's pain rather than try to logically analyze what's causing that other person's pain to understand what we can do rather than just say, "Oh, I can't understand how much it hurts." Like, yeah, that doesn't fucking help me at all. That literally does not help me at all for you to say, "I can't understand." Like, great, yeah, I know you can't understand. You just acknowledged it to me. Great. Now where do we go? So that's kind of where, again, I think we've been mistrained to think that empathy is something where, like, oh, you're supposed to cry about George Floyd if you're not black. You're supposed to cry about police murder. Like, no, you're supposed to figure out how you can help change it if you so care about the problem. Crying about it don't do shit. And that's kind of where, again, the way we've been presented this stuff in culture is theater.
It really
A
is
lot of stuff is just theater. So
big
we gotta
time
know when stuff
posturing.
is just theater.
Yeah, I think that's that's the reality of the world we live in, is that everything is become a performance. So social media is a stage for people to put on the performance of their best life.
That's,
Uh, the Instagram is the same way, except it's pictures, because pictures are worth 1,000 words. Um, and we don't even get the benefit of listening to music. We have to watch it. That's something to wrap one's head around. Watching music, but at the same time, we have all of the technology, and we have a really incredible opportunity. Uh, Tim Lukasik says that this is the dawning of the age of accountability, where we can finally we can hold people accountable for their statements and their actions. And we've got all these cameras, and unfortunately not everyone's using them right. We should be using this for we should be using this to make sure that people are behaving the way they should, and we should hold those people accountable. We can't have people pretending to uphold the social contract if they're not going to uphold the social contract. And that's the biggest problem that we've got, is people who want to defend the system because they believe that it means all these things when they haven't taken the time to reflect upon and understand what the system actually does. And that's dangerous. We live in a society where people are, they're educated, but really it's a system of indoctrination.
yep.
And it's
Yeah.
just, how much more of this can we take? It's an unsustainable situation. And
Well, I think that's a great point to articulate. Like, when real educators aren't teaching people information, they're teaching people how to look at information and how to work with information. And that's where the best educators I've ever had in my life didn't tell me what to think. They helped me learn how to think in a way that I was not capable of thinking previously. And that can be dangerous, in that if it's put on a track, then that person's mind is limited. But as long as the educator gives that person the tools to empower them to keep expanding their understanding, then that is a way to keep enriching that person's ability to understand the world, rather than giving them a limited framework from which to see everything.
yeah, we are family, and that's the reality. And people need to understand that whatever they think is going on, it's probably being framed in a certain way, and it's probably not. It's only going to be beneficial to a very small group of people, and that's why we're the anti-media. I think it's because we want to talk about these things in a way that fosters greater depth of understanding, or at least gives people the idea that, hey, maybe you can understand this stuff too. It just takes a little bit of effort and time spent reading. Sometimes it might be uncomfortable, especially when we are confronted with the cognitive dissonance of realizing that we've been lied to. But it doesn't have to hurt for long, and wounds heal, and there's nothing better than realizing that there is more out there than old beliefs and old ideas and things that only exist to keep us in our place. So, on that note, we've got a nice exclusive mix coming up on Radio Callisti. The link to the stream is in the description. It's our good friend DJ 27, and I think you're going to enjoy it. So if you would all feel free to tune over there. And that's all we got for the day. Thanks for listening.
Exceptional Radio. Exceptional Randos Show is produced live in Sunroom Studios Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.